Welcome to the deep dive. This time, we're tackling how we learn languages, and wow, you've really outdone yourself with this reading list.
Yeah, there are some seriously in-depth stuff here.
Academic papers, research studies, you name it.
Hmm.
We're not just skimming the surface this time, we're going deep into the science of language acquisition itself.
What I found fascinating was the variety of perspectives you've brought together. I mean, you've got everything from classic theories like Krashen's input hypothesis, which, completely changed how we think about language teaching,
Right.
to really cutting-edge research on how our brains actually make sense of new languages.
So much to dig into. Okay, so from toddlers babbling their first words to, adults like me struggling with subjunctive verbs.
Uh-huh.
How do we actually crack the code of a new language? Where do we even begin?
Well, one thing that really stands out from pretty much all these sources is this idea of comprehensible input.
Okay.
It's this kind of sweet spot where the language you're exposed to is challenging enough that you can actually learn from it, but not so complex that it just goes completely over your head.
Oh, like when you finally understand a joke in a foreign film.
Exactly.
You've leveled up.
You got it. But it's about more than just getting the joke or understanding the words on the surface.
Okay.
Think of it this way. When the input is comprehensible, it allows your brain to start building connections. It's creating a mental model of how the language works.
So it's not just passively absorbing information.
Right.
It's about actively making sense of it.
Exactly. And one of the studies you had me read about really illustrated this. Remember the one with people learning Japanese vocabulary?
Yeah, the group that used images and audio alongside the words learned way better than those just trying to memorize the spellings.
That's the one. And it perfectly shows how comprehensible input goes beyond just, those abstract symbols on a page.
Right.
These learners were engaging with the language in this multisensory way, creating these richer, more vivid representations in their brains.
So it's not just what you're learning, but how you're learning it.
I think that's a key takeaway from a lot of this research.
What about grammar, though? Does all this mean we should just forget about learning the rules? I mean, I spent years diagramming sentences in school.
Oh, absolutely. Grammar has its place, and this is where Krashen's distinction between acquisition and learning comes in.
Okay.
Think of acquisition as that natural, unconscious process,
Right.
like how kids just soak up their first language just by being around it.
Mm-hmm.
Learning, on the other hand, is more conscious. It's about, studying those rules and structures.
So I acquired English as a kid, but I learned Spanish in high school more consciously with textbooks and all that.
Exactly. And while that kind of learning can be really helpful, especially for things like writing or, giving formal speeches,
Sure.
the research pretty consistently shows that real fluency, that kind of effortless use of the language, comes from consistent exposure to comprehensible input. You need that unconscious feel for the language, and one study actually found that even when people focus really hard on memorizing grammar rules, they still made mistakes in spontaneous speech.
Wow.
It's like their brains hadn't truly internalized those rules, if that makes sense.
That's a good point. Knowing the rules isn't the same as really acquiring the language.
Right, and for that, you need that intuitive grasp that comes from lots and lots of meaningful exposure.
So does this mean immersion is the key?
Yeah.
Just surround yourself with the language 24/7?
Well, it's not quite that simple. There's more to it than just the amount of exposure.
Oh, okay.
One really fascinating aspect that these sources highlight is this idea of the affective filter.
The affective filter.
Yeah, basically it's this kind of mental barrier that can actually block out learning. Things like stress, self-consciousness, even feeling like you don't connect with the culture can raise your affective filter.
So you're saying all that can make it harder to learn even if you understand the words.
Exactly. It's like trying to learn with earplugs in.
So all that immerse yourself in the culture advice isn't just some feel-good thing.
Right. There's actual science behind it.
That's so interesting.
When you're engaged and motivated, your brain is just way more receptive to new information.
So it's not just about being surrounded by the language. It's about feeling comfortable and connected to it.
Precisely. And studies have actually shown that language learners who really connect with the culture, who feel like they belong, tend to learn much faster than those who feel alienated or self-conscious.
Makes sense. One of the papers you gave me even talked about how our brains build these simulations when we learn languages.
Yeah.
It mentioned something called perceptual symbols. This is where things start to get a little mind-bending, right?
It does get pretty wild here.
Yeah.
This latest research suggests that language isn't just about these abstract symbols floating around in our heads.
Okay.
It's deeply connected to our senses and our experiences.
Hmm.
When we learn a new word, our brain creates this kind of simulation, linking the word to sights, sounds, smells, even emotions.
So it's not just knowing the word for apple. It's like you're actually experiencing the apple in your mind, the
Yeah.
pace, the crunch, the whole experience.
Exactly. And this helps explain why things like storytelling, role-playing, or using visual aids can be so effective.
Okay.
They help us create these richer, more meaningful simulations.
Hold on. So you're saying that's why they always tell you to watch movies or read in the language you're learning?
That's one reason, yes. It's not just about, the words on the page or the dialogue on the screen.
Right.
It's about the whole experience, the emotional context, the images that come to mind.
Hmm.
All those elements feed into building these mental simulations, making the language more real, more tangible.
This is really making me think about those studies that show bilingual people having all those cognitive advantages,
Oh, yeah.
like being better at multitasking and things like that. It's like their brains are constantly juggling multiple simulations.
There could be a connection there for sure.
So learning a language isn't just about communication. It's about actually rewiring your brain.
It really is.
What about that whole idea of some people just being good at languages? Is there any truth to that?
Well, it's definitely more nuanced than that. One thing that came up in several of the papers was this concept of natural pedagogy.
Natural pedagogy.
Yeah, it's the idea that humans are basically hardwired to teach and learn languages.
Interesting.
It's not about having some magical talent. It's about how our brains are actually designed.
So you're saying we're all born with a kind of language learning toolkit. What does that look like in practice?
Well, think about babies for a second.
Okay.
They're like these incredible language detectives. They're wired to pick up on all those little cues like eye contact, pointing changes in tone of voice,
Wow.
all those things that help them figure out what adults are trying to say.
It's like they're constantly searching for patterns, testing hypotheses about how this whole language thing works.
Exactly. And on the flip side, think about how adults instinctively change how they talk to babies.
Yeah.
Simpler sentences, exaggerated intonation, lots of repetition. It's like we're subconsciously creating the perfect language learning environment.
So it's not just about innate ability. It's about this back and forth, this dance between the learner and the teacher.
That's a great way to put it. And this natural pedagogy, it doesn't just disappear when we get older.
Really?
It still plays a role in how we learn new languages, even as adults.
Mm-hmm.
We're still drawn to those social cues, those interactions that help us make sense of the language.
Which kind of brings us back to the importance of social interaction
Right.
and cultural immersion.
Absolutely.
It's not just about the language itself. It's about the context,
Yeah.
the human connection.
One of the sources you pick actually talked about this.
Oh, yeah.
They called it joint attention,
Joint attention.
which is basically the ability to focus on something together with another person.
Okay.
And this is crucial for language development
How so?
because when a baby and an adult share attention, it creates the space for meaningful communication.
I see
It's
that.
where language can be acquired naturally.
So those everyday moments, like pointing at things, naming objects, reading stories together,
Exactly.
they're not just cued, they're actually laying the foundation for language learning.
Precisely. They're providing that scaffolding, the comprehensible input, and the low anxiety environment that's so essential.
And you're saying these same principles apply to learning new languages as adults too.
They do. When we engage in meaningful activities with others, when we're sharing attention and working towards a common goal, it creates this really powerful context for language learning.
There was this other interesting idea in one of the papers about how even the physical environment can impact language learning.
Oh, right.
They talked about affordances. Basically, the opportunities for action that a space provides. So like a classroom with lots of hands-on activities, visual aids, and space to move around might actually be better for language learning than a traditional lecture hall.
That's a really fascinating point. It connects to this idea that language isn't just this abstract system. It's really rooted in our physical and social surroundings.
Yeah.
The more we can interact with the language in a meaningful way, the more those affordances come into play and the better we learn.
It makes me think about those language immersion schools where they design the whole environment from the classroom setup to the posters on the walls to support language learning.
Exactly. It's about creating that immersive experience, a rich ecosystem for language learning that goes way beyond just textbooks and lectures.
One thing that really struck me throughout all this research was the emphasis on how active the learner's role is.
Yes.
It's not about passively absorbing information. It's about actively engaging with the language, experimenting, even making mistakes.
That's so crucial. One of the papers used this phrase, communicate their own voice,
Interesting.
really emphasizing that language learners need the opportunity to express themselves, to use the language in ways that are personally meaningful.
And it doesn't have to be perfect.
It's church and not at the beginning.
This seems to go against all that traditional emphasis on, accuracy and avoiding errors at all costs.
Right. It does. It's about shifting the focus from avoiding mistakes to communicating effectively.
Mm-hmm.
The research actually shows that when we're too afraid of making mistakes, we hold back. We don't take risks with the language.
Right.
But when we feel safe to experiment, that's when the real learning happens.
One study found that students who were encouraged to use humor and playfulness in their language learning were more likely to remember what they learned and feel more confident.
That makes sense.
It seems like when you're having fun, your brain is more engaged and the learning just sticks better.
That's such a great example. It really speaks to the power of positive emotions in language learning.
Yeah.
When we're enjoying ourselves, when we're feeling curious and playful, those emotions actually make our brains work better. They enhance our cognitive processing, making it easier to absorb new information and make those connections.
So it's not just about finding the right method or the perfect textbook.
Right.
It's about cultivating the right mindset.
I think that's key.
An attitude of curiosity, playfulness, and a willingness to embrace the messy, imperfect nature of the learning journey.
Absolutely. It's about seeing language learning as an adventure, a journey of discovery, rather than, a chore or a test to be passed.
I like that.
And that shift in perspective can make all the difference.
Speaking of methods, one of the sources made a strong argument for emphasizing input methods,
Okay.
providing lots of comprehensible input in low-anxiety environments.
Right.
They argued that those tend to be the most effective. So does this mean we should just throw out all those traditional grammar drills and rote memorization?
I wouldn't say they're completely useless.
Okay.
They can definitely have their place, especially for specific aspects of language learning.
Sure.
But the research is pretty clear that they shouldn't be the primary focus.
Mm.
What really drives language acquisition is meaningful interaction, engaging with the language in a way that's both understandable and personally relevant.
So instead of drilling the same grammar rule over and over, it's more about encountering it organically in different stories, songs, conversations.
That's a great way to put it.
One of the studies actually called this natural review.
I like that term.
It's about seeing the language used in different ways in different contexts.
And that's what helps solidify our understanding and build those neural pathways in our brains.
Makes sense. This makes me think about vocabulary. One paper actually went so far as to say that maybe we shouldn't directly teach vocabulary at all.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement.
Right. Their argument was that if we just provide enough comprehensible input vocabulary acquisition, will kind of take care of itself.
That's a pretty radical idea.
I know. It definitely got me thinking.
While there's definitely ongoing debate on the most effective ways to teach vocabulary,
Sure.
there's definitely growing evidence that incidental learning, where we pick up new words just through exposure rather than direct instruction, plays a huge role.
Like when you're reading a book and come across a word you don't know, but you can figure out the meaning from the context.
Exactly. And those incidentally learned words often stick with us better because they're embedded in a meaningful experience.
Which brings us back to making language learning enjoyable and connecting it to your interests.
Right.
If you're really into a novel or engrossed in a movie you love, you're naturally going to pick up new vocabulary without even realizing it.
And those positive emotions, that sense of engagement and enjoyment, make the learning process so much more effective.
It seems like traditional language classes often fall short when it comes to preparing people for real-world communication.
I agree.
One paper talked about the need to incorporate more communicative management tools.
Oh, yeah. Those are essential.
Things like skills for navigating actual conversations, dealing with misunderstandings, keeping the conversation flowing.
Those are the skills that real-world fluency demands. You can know all the grammar and vocabulary in the world. But if you can't actually use the language in different social contexts or handle those inevitable communication breakdowns, what's the point?
Exactly. One of the studies talked about downshifting.
Downshifting.
Yeah, it's how native speakers naturally simplify their language to help non-native speakers understand.
Oh, right.
It seems like language learners need more opportunities to interact with native speakers who are willing to do this.
I agree, but I can imagine that can be tricky in real-life situations.
Oh, totally. People aren't always so patient.
Exactly. That's why having a supportive learning environment is so important.
Like a good language class.
Right. In a well-designed class, you can practice those communicative management tools,
Right.
get feedback from a teacher who understands the challenges, and build your confidence in a low-pressure setting.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
One paper actually suggested that we should completely rethink how we teach grammar.
Oh, really?
Instead of presenting it as this rigid set of rules, maybe we should take a more inductive approach,
What do you mean?
like letting students discover the patterns and make their own generalizations through being exposed to the language.
That's a fascinating idea. It aligns with the idea that language acquisition is about making sense of the world, constructing mental models based on experience.
Yeah.
Rather than just memorizing rules, students are actively figuring out how the language works,
Exactly.
which could lead to a much deeper, more intuitive understanding.
It reminds me of that saying, tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn.
That's a perfect way to sum it up.
It really highlights how incredible our brains are.
They really are.
They can process so much information and figure out these complex patterns without us even realizing it.
The human brain's ability to learn and adapt is truly remarkable. It's constantly rewiring itself based on new experiences.
And language acquisition is a perfect example of that.
For sure. So if our brain, they're so good at picking up languages, why does it feel so difficult for so many people?
That's a good question.
It often comes down to opportunity and approach. If you're not exposed to enough comprehensible input,
Right?
or if your affective filter is high because of anxiety, learning can feel like an uphill battle.
One paper talked about this linguistic bottleneck that's created by traditional teaching methods.
Ah, yeah.
It's like students are bombarded with way too much information all at once, leading to overload and frustration.
It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. When we're flooded with new information, our brains just can't process it all effectively.
Right.
And we end up feeling lost and discouraged.
So finding the right approach is key.
Absolutely.
One that balances challenge and support, keeps that affective filter low, and allows you to learn at your own pace.
It's about finding that sweet spot where you're pushing yourself just enough without getting overwhelmed. The learning process should be engaging and enjoyable, not a constant struggle.
One source pointed out that just knowing the rules doesn't automatically make you fluent.
Right.
They gave this example of a student who could ace all the grammar tests, but still couldn't hold a conversation in the language.
I've definitely met students like that.
What's missing in that situation?
It highlights the difference between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge.
Okay.
Declarative knowledge is knowing the facts about the language,
Okay.
while procedural knowledge is being able to actually use it. It's like knowing the rules of chess versus actually being able to play a good game.
So how do you bridge that gap? How do you go from knowing about the language to actually using it?
It takes practice, exposure, and lots of meaningful interaction.
Yeah.
The more you use the language in real-life situations,
Right.
the more you develop that procedural knowledge, that intuitive feel for how the language works.
One study talked about how learners need to develop automaticity.
Automaticity.
Yeah, it's being able to use the language without having to consciously think about every word and rule.
Oh, right.
It's like driving a car. At first, you're thinking about every single step, the clutch, the gears, the mirrors.
Uh-huh.
But with practice, those actions become automatic. You don't have to think about them anymore. You can just focus on driving.
Exactly. And it's the same with language. At some point, you need to get to that point where you're not constantly translating in your head.
Where the language just flows.
Exactly. That automaticity comes from consistent exposure and practice, from using the language in ways that feel authentic and enjoyable.
One paper even questioned our very definition of fluency.
Oh, really?
In what way? Maybe instead of aiming for this kind of native-like perfection, we should be embracing multi-competence.
Multi-competence. That's an interesting idea.
It's the idea of being able to communicate effectively in multiple languages, even if it's not always flawless.
I like that. It's about recognizing that each language learner brings their own unique perspective and experiences to the table.
Yeah.
Their way of using the language might be different from a native speaker's, but that's not a bad thing. It can actually enrich communication and then bring in new perspectives.
It's about appreciating the diversity of language, acknowledging that there's no one right way to be fluent.
Exactly. It's about enjoying the journey, the ups and downs, the breakthroughs, and the unique voice that each learner brings to the process.
So for anyone listening who's trying to learn a new language, what's the biggest takeaway from all this research?
I'd say focus on finding enjoyable and meaningful ways to engage with the language. Watch films, listen to music, chat with native speakers. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. They're all part of the learning process.
And for those who think they're just bad at languages,
Mm.
remember it's not about some innate talent.
Right?
It's about finding the right approach, keeping your effective filter low, and embracing the journey.
It's about viewing language learning as an adventure, a chance to expand your world, connect with new cultures, and discover new things about yourself along the way.
Beautifully said. Language is more than just words and rules. It's a way to connect with the world and the people in it.
I couldn't agree more.
So keep exploring, keep learning, and stay curious.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of language acquisition. Until next time.
And that's a really good point because a lot of people forget that language is a tool for communication.
Exactly. It's not just about memorizing vocabulary or mastering grammar rules.
Right. It's about being able to actually use the language to express yourself, to connect with other people.
And to navigate real-world situations, which can be messy and unpredictable.
Exactly. Which is why I think this idea of communicative management tools is so important.
Yeah, those skills for keeping the conversation going even when you hit a snag.
Right, like being able to clarify misunderstandings, ask for help, rephrase things.
It's about being resourceful and adaptable.
And those skills often get overlooked in traditional language classes.
That's true. I remember in my high school Spanish class, we focused so much on grammar and vocabulary,
Right.
but we hardly ever got to practice actually having conversations.
It's like they were preparing us for a written exam, not for real-life communication.
Exactly. One of the studies even suggested that maybe we need to completely rethink how we teach grammar.
Interesting. How so?
Instead of presenting it as this rigid set of rules,
Mm-hmm.
maybe we should take a more inductive approach,
Oh, I see what you mean.
like letting students discover the patterns and figure things out for themselves through exposure to the language.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It aligns with this idea that language acquisition is about making sense of the world.
Right.
It's about constructing those mental models based on your experiences.
So instead of just memorizing rules,
Right.
students are actively engaged in figuring out how the language works,
Which could lead to a much deeper, more intuitive understanding.
and hopefully more fluency in the long run.
Exactly. Because ultimately, fluency is about being able to use the language effortlessly and naturally.
Without having to stop and think about every little rule.
Right. It's about being able to communicate your ideas and connect with people in a meaningful way.
One paper actually used a really interesting analogy for this.
Oh, yeah. What was it?
They compared language fluency to riding a bike.
I like that.
At first, when you're learning to ride a bike,
Yeah.
you have to think about every single movement.
You're wobbling all over the place.
Exactly. But with practice, it becomes second nature.
You don't even have to think about it. You just get on and ride.
And it's the same with language. Once you reach a certain level of fluency, you're not translating in your head anymore.
Right.
The words just flow.
And you can focus on the message you want to convey.
Precisely. But getting to that point takes time and effort.
It does. There's no magic shortcut.
But one thing that can really help is finding the right approach.
Absolutely. One that aligns with your learning style, keeps your motivation high, and makes the whole process enjoyable.
Because if you're not enjoying it, you're less likely to stick with it.
Exactly. Language learning should be an adventure, not a chore.
I love that, an adventure. That's a great way to think about it. It's about exploring new worlds, connecting with new people, and discovering new ways of expressing yourself.
And who knows what you might discover about yourself along the way.
Exactly. It's amazing how much our brains can do without us even realizing it.
It really is. And one of the most incredible things about the human brain is its capacity for language.
Yeah, it's like we're hardwired for it in a way.
Absolutely. And this research really dives deep into the mechanisms behind that, how we acquire language, how we process it, how we use it to communicate.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it.
It really is. And the implications of this research are huge, not just for language learners, but for anyone interested in the human mind and how it works.
So for those of you out there who are trying to learn a new language, what are some key takeaways from all this research?
Well, one of the biggest things is to focus on getting lots of comprehensible input.
That sweet spot we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Find materials that are challenging but not overwhelming. Things you actually enjoy.
Like movies, books, music, podcasts.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to experiment with different learning methods. Find what works best for you.
And what about grammar? Should we just throw out all the textbooks and forget about the rules?
Not necessarily grammar is still important, but it shouldn't be the main focus.
So instead of drilling those rules over and over,
Right. Try to encounter them organically through meaningful interaction with the language.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Exactly. Mistakes are a natural part of the learning process.
They're how we learn and grow.
And remember, it's not about achieving some kind of native-like perfection.
Right.
It's about being able to communicate effectively and connect with others.
And enjoy the journey.
Absolutely.
Language learning should be a fun and rewarding experience.
It's a chance to expand your horizons and connect with the world in a whole new way.
So keep exploring, stay curious, and never stop learning.
That's great advice. Well, looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Time flies when you're having fun with linguistics.
It really does. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating exploration of language acquisition.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.